Yeah. Good morning. Well, okay, it's live. It's really wonderful to be here. I appreciate the weather that you arranged for me, and I've been hearing about this center for at least 8 or 10 years. A colleague of mine, who's since passed, Ted Buswick, was very involved in the advisory board here and first told me about the remarkable things that happen here, and have two very close and long-standing friends and colleagues sitting over there in the front row that have played an important role and really kind of central roles in this whole story that I'll be telling today. So get it out of the way and introduce them. I think you probably know many of them: Todd Seiler, Gary Stoyer. So yeah. So what I thought I would do with our time is, since there is so much kind of history and context for me and for my work sitting in this building, I thought I'd take just a couple of minutes to sort of sketch out my journey to this point, and then sort of take you through the evolution of the work that we've done over these past years, and then maybe wrap it up with a few thoughts about where it goes from here and take some questions. So where it started. So my background, as Matt said, was as a musician. I learned to read music before I learned to read English. I was a classically trained violinist. In college, I started hanging out with the rough crowd, so I did theater. And so music and theater were the first half of my career. And for a lot of years working in those realms, I found myself as the executive director of a really remarkable orchestra called Orpheus Chamber Orchestra. Some of you know the orchestra. At least one of you have played with the orchestra. In addition to being an extraordinary group of musicians who make really remarkable music across a broad range of repertoire, they're also the only orchestra in the world that rehearses and records and performs all of its work without a conductor. And so this goes back about 20 years. And if you think back to the world 20 years ago, it was just at the time where the changes in the IT revolution were kind of hitting a point of critical mass, and layers of middle management were being sort of smashed out of the picture, and responsibility was being pushed downward into the hands of people who were actually doing work. And that raised a lot of interest in models of flat and flexible organizations. And I found myself at the time at the helm of a flat and flexible organization, and one that was eager to find ways to bridge to audiences for classical music, the traditional audiences being in the process of shrinking. So we began to kind of experiment with that. And the more I looked at how the orchestra did its work, the more I came to feel that there was some really powerful opportunities for learning that were embedded and embodied in that process. And that if we could find the right ways to do it, that it could have implications not just for orchestras or arts organizations, but for a broad range of human endeavor and activity. So we set up a lab at the City University of New York. We began experimenting with different ways that we could work with the orchestra. We taught 150 classes in organizational psychology and management and lots of different things, and began to sort of unpack all of that. Eventually, we got a lot of attention for that work. We were the subject of a Harvard case study, and there were pieces in international media and that kind of thing. And we actually formed a management consultancy with Orpheus, so that we started touring the world, doing concerts in wonderful concert halls at night, and working with Fortune 500 companies by day, which is unusual, kind of interesting, a little difficult to manage in the specifics of it. But after a number of years of doing that, and after I wrote a book about it and so forth, when I left the orchestra, I started thinking a lot about what had happened there, because it clearly had become a phenomenon that kind of surprised me. And I began to kind of poke my head above ground and started having conversations with people. One of the people that I started talking with was Gary, who was an old friend at that time. And Gary was running an organization, the Arts and Business Council. He was its CEO. And Gary shared my interest in this emerging phenomena. And together we began to explore ways that we might be able to actually develop a field, because I became increasingly aware that there was actually kind of other experiments that were going on in the same year, in the same years. So one of the people whose work I became familiar with at that time was Todd, who was already had decades of work at the intersection of art and science, and was developing extraordinary both works of art but also learning processes which could work with art to connect all kinds of knowledge in very purposeful ways. So I met many, many people and began to feel that there was actually a field of arts-based learning that needed to be a convener. I decided that that would be an interesting thing to do. Gary, on behalf of the Arts and Business Council, agreed. And as we were in the process of merging with Americans for the Arts, we formed something called Creativity Connection. So for a number of years, we did all kinds of things. We did model projects, and we worked with corporations. We published special editions of the Journal of Business Strategy, many, many things to try to advance this field. So this is kind of where I'm going to pick up the story a little bit. And I'm going to start with a slide. This was one of the projects that Americans for the Arts was involved with the conference board. This goes back 15 years now, or close to it. And what it was a study of interviewing 400 corporate leaders. And in this portion of the study, they were asking questions about what they considered to be the most critical skills that would define success in the 21st century workforce. And they were also asking those same leaders, how do you think those skills are showing up in the people that are coming to you looking for work? The results are pretty clear. So we started calling that the innovation gap. We started working with that as something to engage people and interest people. Todd said, you know, I've been doing an art exhibition at the National Science Foundation. There's a program director there that might be interested in this. So why don't we go talk to him? So we did. And what ultimately emerged out of that was a wonderful symposium there, where we were joined by the choreographer Liz Lerman, and we did stuff. And what grew out of that were a series of really rich conversations that I began to have with the NSF. And what they basically said is, why don't we start by bringing a bunch of people together and exploring this topic? And maybe you want to think about research and practice both. So we convened 3 national conferences at the Smithsonian and at Cal IT2 and so forth. So, yep. So we had 250 educators at these conferences that were working with arts-based learning in different ways. And these are just a few of the things that they told us that they were seeing. But they also told us that the resources were fragmentary, that they had no way of actually demonstrating or measuring impact, and that there were real limitations, although their actual experience was very powerful. So we also brought together 90 researchers from around the country, lots of different research disciplines, methodologies, approaches, backgrounds. I'll just share a few of the types of data that existed at that point, which were some of the strongest points that we were able to find. This is an eye tracking study. So if you think of that image as how a typical person sees the world, they're focusing on the obvious place at the center, a quick check of the peripheries. They're covering 8% of the picture. And then this is your brain on art. Or more specifically, what happens to undergraduates when they spend a semester looking at, and thinking about. And the amount of the world that's being covered, the unpredictability of the directions of that coverage, and the fact that in the team, you then begin to integrate many, many more viewpoints was pretty powerful. So this was an experimental study that we actually found sitting on a shelf at Cooper Union, and we ended up publishing, that showed what happens when you integrate dance, theater, and music into engineering education. So this was the control group. This is what happened to those communication skills when they started integrating theater and music. And then this remarkable result when they integrated dance as well, showing that it's more than maybe a parlor trick about speaking skills. It has much more to do with embodiment, where we stand in the world, how we relate to others, how we conceptualize knowledge in ourselves, and what we do with that. And then finally, Robert Ruth Bernstein, who's done a whole series of these studies. This is just one, but Bob's been a pioneer in this for decades. And in this study in particular, and many of his, he looks historically. This one looks at 100 years of Nobel Prize data and shows these astounding correlations between high performance in science compared with other people with distinguished careers but had not achieved that kind of recognition for breakthrough innovation that goes with the Nobel, and others, and the correlation to the practice in a hobby, in an avocational kind of way, of different kinds of art forms and art practices. Okay, so that's what we had. But we didn't have a lot of hard evidence that we could tie anything to what the impacts were. So the researchers did a lot of work, wrote a report. The report was actually authored by Martin Storkstieg, who at the time was the director of the Board on Science Education for the Academies, and pretty clearly stated the challenge or the issue, what we needed to do. So around that time began another round of conversations with the NEA, with the NSF. And what they said was, okay, so there's a lot of smoke here. How do we find out if there's fire? And innovation seemed to be a great connecting point for a lot of these things. So we decided to create a curriculum that used the arts to teach innovation. We focused on innovation for a lot of reasons. One is the central place that it had in the workforce development issues that drove a lot of the NSF interest in this. But also because one of the ways you could think about innovation is this journey of steps, which are very practical steps, and the arts make fantastic practice domains for getting good at some of these skills and these steps. So we decided, as I said, to create a curriculum using the arts. So that was a reasonably big task. First, we needed to understand what we meant by innovation. So what we did is we looked at about 400 innovation processes in different types of organizations, large and small, American and global, for-profit, not-for-profit, very different kinds of organizations. And they're all very different, but they do share some common features, almost all of them. They almost all have this front end, often called the fuzzy front of innovation, where it's generally conceded that the typical analytical rules don't apply and that we're open to lots of possibilities, represented by a funnel. That moves into this sort of linear, or if I were going to be more accurate and we're better at rendering these PowerPoint slides, I would actually call it a spiral, because it's a spiral process of development. But it's linear in the sense that it's clearly intended to get from this fuzzy front to the back end, where we actually have something, a product, a process, a service, something that can go out into the market. We have some filters and some gates along the way, and it turns out that how many of those and where you place them is kind of critical. And so we use that as our conceptual model. So we went one step further, and we tried to reduce that model to a series of steps. Think of this as the stylized innovation process. And if you looked at all the innovation processes out there, the vast majority of them you could identify those steps, whatever it is that they call them, and they would happen in roughly those sequences. So now we went back to all these things that the 250 educators in our own experience told us you could accomplish through the arts, and we connected the dots. And that's basically how we built the curriculum. Okay, so that was about a year or 18 months of work. So then we wanted to test the curriculum. So we built 3 incubators for innovation in San Diego, Chicago, and Worcester, Massachusetts. And each one of these incubators was housed and nested in a large center for informal learning. We were clear that we wanted informal learning because, among other things, we intended to break a lot of rules. And we figured if we started where there weren't so many rules constricting us, we'd probably have a better run of it. So in particular, That meant that we would be free to think about cross-disciplinary learning, multi-generational learning communities, different points of engagement, different ways of measuring, all kinds of things that were very different in the informal settings. So with our partners, our host partners in each of those cities, so in San Diego, it was the Balboa Park Cultural Partnership, which is actually 26 nonprofits, ranging from the art museum to the zoo. And really a remarkable place. In Chicago, it was something very different. It was the Museum of Science and Industry, which is actually the largest science center in the Western Hemisphere. And in Worcester, which is a much smaller community, we had the oldest indoor-outdoor natural history museum in the Americas. And in Worcester, we had a community that historically was a center of innovation. Back in the time of the Revolutionary War and up until the Civil War, 50% of all patents in America were nested in Worcester. And then other things happened. So we thought it would be an interesting place to put an incubator for innovation. So with each partner, we in turn engaged lots of people in the community. And we together identified a STEM challenge. We really didn't put many constraints on the communities other than that they couldn't duplicate what another community had already chosen. And that we had to have some recognizable and identifiable form of STEM content, which of course is most things. So they really had a very open-ended opportunity to decide how they wanted to spend the year that these incubators would run and the opportunity for their community. So in San Diego, not surprisingly, at the height of the drought, they chose water resources. In Chicago, urban nutrition. And in Worcester, transportation alternatives. And if you've ever been to Worcester, you'll understand why. So we did it with these host partners, but I just want to give you a flavor for the kind of community engagement that was involved. This is just one of the incubators. This is San Diego. These were our partners in San Diego. So we brought together a tremendous array of for-profit and not-for-profit and small and large and community-based and academic institutions, formal learning centers, research centers, policymakers, lots of different types of individuals and entities that really got behind this work and contributed to it in key ways. This never could have happened without it. And we had these kinds of networks of partners in each of the communities. Okay, so we had our incubators. We needed to populate them. So we spent a few months recruiting. It was both easy and hard to recruit. It was easy because the idea fascinated a lot of people. It was hard because the NSF grant didn't pay stipends for the participants. So they essentially had to volunteer to spend 100, in some cases by choice, they ended up spending much more than that, but 100 hours over the course of a year, learning and doing innovation in this new way. And they had to be people that were ready and willing to work way outside their comfort zone. We intentionally did not recruit for domain expertise. And where we saw domain expertise, we wanted to be sure that they were still open to working in some very different kinds of ways before they were admitted. So they all had to apply, and it was a competitive process. In the end, we had many more applicants than we had places for them. And as you can see, it was a very unusual kind of cross-disciplinary mashup of people. So we had artists and scientists and business leaders and public officials. We had high school students and university presidents, all in these collaborative learning communities. Okay, so that was sort of all the curtain raiser. And this was the opening. So this was in San Diego. We did these sessions in the other incubators as well. The very first thing they did. This is Todd's metaforming process come to life. And in the metaforming process, there's a focal question that we ask people to do this sort of collaborative idea, invention, modeling, and connection of knowledge. And that focal question that we decided on wasn't about the challenges, it was about innovation, and it was about themselves. Because we believe very powerfully that innovation starts with I. and that we needed to talk about that point of engagement. So what does innovation mean to me? And that's what they worked on. And when we came back to them at the very end of the incubators, the last thing the incubators did before their big launch parties was a final session. And we did metaforming again. And the final question there, what does innovation mean to me now? And the journeys that documented and brought to life were really remarkable. So from there, we went into the first 4 steps, that front end, that fuzzy funnel. We thought it was important enough that we had people do it twice. The first time they did it, they went through those steps to learn processes and to learn what it meant to work with the arts and innovation and to learn all these new things. And then the second time they did it was to make it their own and to apply it to their innovation challenges in the way that they want to apply it. And we had local faculty and local people co-designing those sessions with us. So the first time that we did it, I'm going to show you this because I find this an incredibly useful little model. So if you go back to this slide at those 4 steps, if you turn it on its side, that's what it looks like. And that became not only a way of thinking about innovation, but in fact a way of thinking about the creative process itself. The body's a little heuristic about creativity, that it's these 2 successive waves of divergent convergent thought. The first one is around what's the problem, the one that we sometimes skip to our peril. And then the second one about how do I want to solve it. And so we spent as much time on finding the problem as we did on finding the solution. And we recognized that it had to proceed with many possibilities in order to apply the right criteria that we had determined to choose the one possibility to move forward with. So we worked with introspection, reflection, journaling. These are a group of jazz musicians from our national faculty, and they do a kind of open-ended improv. We find that the search for opportunity that would come out of the kind of spiky starts to their pieces was a wonderful way to sort of spark some open-ended observation on the part of the fellows, and they're beginning to discover new opportunities. So we work with a process that we call transliteration. So we're all familiar with this basic idea of we observe and then we gain insights. Transliterate, we take the observation, we capture it in some art form or another, and we find that we get richer insights. And we did that process time and time again. We found that sometimes that we would do it 2 and 3 times around the same observations because each time we applied a new art form, different insights came out. So, of course, we worked with data visualizations. This is a famous one. This was actually the first one ever done. But we went beyond how to visualize the data to how to embody it. A process that we called feeling numbers as a way of intuitively coming to understand the significance of data. So this quote brings to life a lot of things. It certainly does with metaforming, and it's so much a part of how and why we start with metaforming. But we use it in many, many different ways and across the incubators. Here, what they're actually doing is they're taking idea models, but they're modeling the criteria and see if the idea is balanced among the criteria enough to stand. And a lot around ideation. So I love that quote. The best way to have a good idea is to have a lot of ideas. So think of that iceberg as the idea space. And the 10% of it that's above the waterline is where we tend to live. We have a lot of great tools. It's easy, it's clear, it's logical, it's measurable. We can perceive it, we can do things with it, we can analyze it, and so forth. So what we set out to do is use the arts to dive deeper. Go after what's not so obvious, what's murky and intuitive and ambiguous and holistic and indirect, and to see where you can't see. So that was the first time. The second time they did it, they brought it to life. Here they are, the fellows at a makerspace in the middle of the drought when suddenly it started raining. And here they are capturing what they observed and transliterating and making things with it in the moment on the spot. We used a sort of a surrealist blender of different kinds of techniques to approach ideation in a fundamentally different way, get it more of that iceberg. In Worcester, their challenge was transportation. They spent the day riding different forms of transportation, observing, then capturing those observations in notes, but also in haiku. So this one day sort of embodies, I think, a great deal about the project. These are a group of them setting out for a day of art science in a neighborhood in the estuary near Balboa Park. So there they are. They're gathering data. They're observing the conditions. They're immediately transliterating it in the moment. They're reducing that to different ideas and concepts. They're building models based on their observations around those concepts. They're using those models to communicate their ideas and discuss them and argue back and forth among each other. Then they build again. 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 So when they finally went through that process, the last day of this front end, they had, each incubator had a kind of a museum day, an exhibition of solution ideas that they wanted to work on. And so different teams that weren't even formed as teams yet, but were starting to coalesce around these ideas. They built them to model them, to discuss them. And then it was done. They had their ideas, they sorted themselves out by their own democratic processes. We facilitated, occasionally we put a light finger on a scale if a train wreck seemed like it was about to happen. But for the most part, the 29 teams that emerged were the 29 teams they wanted to be on, working on the things they wanted to be working on. And so now we were suddenly in a different phase of the incubators because we'd been in these large learning communities of 100. Now we were in teams and learning communities of 10. Some were going really fast. Some were going very slow. So to hold the incubator together during that period, we gave them all mentors. But we also did these workshops around different things. So we worked with musical ensembles, classical, jazz, and then doing it themselves around high performance teamwork. Taught them a process called rehearsing ideas, which uses all kinds of theater techniques to essentially learn a rapid fire iterative process where you're able to actually use feedback to learn and apply it to iteration and go through 4 prototypes in 2.5 hours. And we had artists in residence creating these very different kinds of works in the incubator with the involvement of the fellows. So there was all of that ferment going on as well. This is a graphic novel in Chicago, this extraordinary sculptural piece in San Diego, a place for reflection, and a sort of a meta mapping of the whole process of these incubators in Worcester. So finally, they went into the development of these ideas as they made it through the gates, and some were actually bounced back 2, 3, even 1 was 4 times, but they all made it. And so this is a good place to introduce a few of the teams. We don't have too much time, so I'll just show you a couple of them quickly. This is Trash to Paradise. This is a team that essentially, it's a binational team. Half of them were from Baja, half from San Diego. So imagine people from Baja that were getting up at 5 in the morning every Saturday to come across the border and do what they had to do to get through the border in order to participate. And then we started going down there. And then we developed these extraordinary collaborations in Baja. And out of that grew this idea to create an artificial wetland filtration system. Take the large particulate trash and use it to essentially help clean up and turn black water to gray water. Hence the name Trash to Paradise. And so they actually were able to eventually find a church outside of Baja, Tijuana, on a mountainside, and partner with that church and create one of these, and involve hundreds of volunteers from the community. Curriculum, because many of the innovations were actually different curriculum. And this is one in Chicago, a middle school curriculum that was designed to use next generation science standards to. This is one in Worcester that actually turned into a Department of Transportation grant after the life of the incubator for essentially an algorithm that was able to automatically take into account the optimizing of public transportation routes and schedules when scheduling medical appointments. And that was locked into the, into the largest medical center in Worcester, into their scheduling. So this is a little mini case study of one team, just to show you the kinds of transformations that they went through. They started off, this was in their idea phase before they were even a team. By a month later, as they were getting ready to go through the first gate, they had sort of organized themselves pretty clearly around certain things that they were trying to accomplish. A mobile innovation and demonstration center on water resources. It could be a community resource in Balboa Park. And then they immediately, once they went through the gate, they immediately started to build it. Here they are with their Arduino board tweeting out moisture readings from their garden 24/7 to a growing group of followers. So these guys had what I'll call a Jack of the Beanstalk model for business development. So they decided that they were going to go to the county fair. They were going to build one of these, a prototype. They were going to win first prize at the county fair. They were going to use that money to develop the project. So here they are in May, building it at the county fair. First prizes. They did it. So these teams did of volunteers, of high school students and business leaders and artists and scientists and all of these people working together, not being paid and outside of their domain expertise, and accomplishing some remarkable things. We did all of this while engaging the community on lots of levels, not only because that was an important thing to do and part of our mission, but also because it was a fantastic source of learning and development for all of these ideas. Play date for 800 educators that we organized in Balboa Park. So our teams, but also lots of others in the San Diego area, and learning from each other. So altogether, a year later, we had, of these 29 teams, 22 of them actually went to market. Astounding success rate, with at least minimum viable versions of products, processes, services that met all the criteria, which were fairly strict criteria for novelty, value, and impact. And I can tell you today, because I just heard about this a few days ago, it's now 5 years since the first incubator closed. 2 of those teams formed companies and are still at it and have had considerable success. A nonprofit in Worcester that formed out of all of this, Task for Transit, has raised millions of dollars in grants, and they've used that to essentially, it's a sharing economy rideshare process that also involves the middleman and the banking are volunteer hours that people in the community spend volunteering for the nonprofits. Everybody wins. In San Diego, we had one fellow and a few of her comrades in arms who really weren't so interested in water. They were interested in bees, in pollinators. And they connected it to water because we were insistent, but they really wanted to do that. And they have now a commercial company which has just done their 1,500th installation across the country. They map it, they get data from all of these. It's fantastic to see. So, okay. So that's what we did. This is a little bit about what we learned. We set out to measure these 3 things: thinking skills, collaborative behaviors, innovation output. We had a few hypotheses. And we decided to do this with fully experimental studies. Since the incubators were way too messy to do experimental research, after we had completed all of the incubators, we did it again, but on a small scale, a 5-week version of it, tightly controlled, and we did it under experimental conditions. We did control and treatment groups, and we did it in 2 sites. In Worcester, we did high school students. In San Diego, we did adult early career professionals, STEM professionals. The control groups all had 20 hours of innovation, learning, and doing around a challenge, and it was good active learning, project-based, and it was the very best innovation training that we could find. We worked with the Product Development Management Association and people that had worked with our project over the years to help design that curriculum. Then we took their curriculum, scooped out 9 of the 20 hours and replaced it with arts-based learning that we felt would accomplish the same things, but perhaps better. And metaforming was part of that, but so was theater and lots of different elements that were part of that. So we found that, I'm not for the interest of time going to go into it, but we actually also, in addition to applying sort of standard validated scales and measures that we felt were somewhat relevant, we actually created a new instrument, which now, 5 years later and 35 rounds of pilots later, has become a new way of measuring the ability to apply creative thinking skills to real-world challenges. So what we found is that there were statistically significant positive differences. High school students around a whole range of creative thinking skills, and that the control participants had no such improvement. As a matter of fact, the blue are the control participants. They actually went down, which will only be surprising to those of you who don't have any kids in high school or never taught high school or never went to high school. But the differences were extraordinary. Okay, second, collaborative behaviors. Found that the adult participants had these remarkable differences: trust and mutual respect and emotionally intelligent behavior, transparency and openness and sharing, lots and lots of different skills that we looked at, behaviors. These are examples. This shows the difference. So 2 things about this data. They both get better because they practice teamwork, but the arts-based groups get better, much better. The other is that it takes time. Nobody got better at first. But we see that same pattern through just 3 of the 11 skills that we looked at. Third, that the actual team outputs at the end of all this different. And we found that there were very significant differences based on blind external judging. And as you can see, some of these differences are as much as 2 points on a 5-point scale. Insight, clarity, problem solving, impact, all of these key elements and cornerstones of innovation. Finally, this is something we didn't set out to study, but that we happened to kind of stumble on. And this relates to transferability of skills, longer-term impact, and agency. So first we found that among the high school students, there were these significant differences in how they were able to work with what they had experienced 4 months later. But we also saw this really interesting thing, and we only saw it among the arts-based students. There were a whole group of arts-based students who basically told us, I'm not using it now, I'm not using what I learned in my school, in my life, but I see how I will use it. That says a great deal. So I could, as you can see, go on with this. I've already gone on too long, so I'm gonna kind of hold it up there and open it up for what time we have for questions. Yeah. Yeah. So first, we didn't set out to do this, but what we actually did was we developed an extraordinary process for community and innovation that applies to a whole range of things. And every day we see in every aspect of our life and our work, and as citizens in this society, the urgent need for that. And we see in our own work how well that works. So we intend to keep working at that and developing that. Second, we have an instrument now that is really fairly remarkable in its ability to reveal what people are actually learning in terms of the ability to not only develop their skills, but apply their skills in creative thinking. And so we intend to expand our use of that. It has a way to go in terms of digitizing the delivery, although that's almost done, and more complex the scoring, which will be done. And then finally, these incubators are sprawling. And I gave you a little flavor of it. We have hundreds of hours of workshops. And so a lot of what we've done over the last couple of years is begun to take those and turn them into very impactful and very efficient ways of sharing certain kinds of learning experiences that really have power and resonance in shorter and shorter periods of time. And so applying those as well in lots of different sectors. Yes?
Hi, thank you for this very inspired kind of expose. A couple questions, and maybe you can iterate on a couple things you said. So I'm assuming this is through the NSF's informal science learning, is
Correct.
that? Okay, and if you could drill down a little bit into higher education partnerships and how it translates into curriculum that would fit into our existing curriculum, as well as kind of training the trainer,
yep,
such as our faculty.
Yep. So I'm going to take the second part of it first, because it's now becoming, for the first time, a significant part of our work. But as we see the demand for it and the desire to scale this increasingly and apply to different circumstances, we're actually spending a lot of time now around training the trainer types of programs, and we have a couple of them that are sort of in prototype and development. So we've had a large number of partnerships with universities along the way, and the best of those have taken place where we have communities of people that are interested in looking outward and engaging beyond the institution. Those are some of the easiest and the most natural fits, but we also see that they can be very powerful experiences for students. So, for example, we did a project at Clark a couple of years ago, where we actually did a week of deep immersion in this kind of program. And we took them through a real innovation journey. So the context for this was that this was over a spring break, and there were a large number of Chinese students that were in no position to go home. And so they were hanging out in spring break. And the English abilities of those students were mixed. And so we needed something that could engage them effectively without respect to any language barriers, and where real learning and impact could take place. So we did that there, and it was a really wonderful experience. I actually see that and that type of thing not only on breaks, but also as part of immersion experiences for first-year students and all kinds of things as potential ways of doing it. Another way that we've worked with it has been with some faculty development workshops to sort of help them to mentor and foster innovation projects. We've done collaborations with Fordham around that. We are kind of exploring a couple where we're going to try to, what we haven't done yet, but which I'm eagerly looking for opportunities to do, is to actually take elements of this curriculum and weave them into core curriculum. In particular, an area, and I know we were talking about this here on campus earlier, and it's come up in some other institutions as well. Some of the core curricular requirements where the arts pieces of it find it difficult to land with traction and focus and impact in students, and that this may be a strategy where some very powerful learnings that also, in a very authentic way, connect them deeply to the art, because they'll actually be making the art. So I think that those are incredibly promising directions that this can be. Did that answer? Or?
No, that's great. Just to pile on to exactly what you're saying, no comment necessary, but I think this is a high impact practice in reaching more diverse students, particularly within STEM fields. So when you're looking at retention around women in STEM,
absolutely,
as well as those demographics that are underserved, working project-based, through the arts and humanities is kind of the golden ticket, right?
Absolutely, and I didn't touch on this in talking earlier, but in fact, that was part of the NSF's initial core interest in it. One of the pieces of research that, in the interest of time, I cut the slide out, but Cheryl Sorby's work in Michigan around how the impact that as little as 20 hours of drawing can have on the spatial thinking skills of visual and spatial thinking skills of middle school girls, and how that relates to sort of STEM trajectories. There's a ton of things like that.
I hope, sorry, to build on Lori's question and also maybe hand it off to Gary too, who knows a lot about this, but I would imagine this work plays very strongly into this whole field of the creative economy and impact investing. And so where would you envision, ideally, the companies, for-profit, nonprofit, that would actually be most helpful to build this out and do it in a very rigorous way, especially with the quantitative piece here?
Yeah. So a couple of things. The first is that in many ways, a lot of the things that you saw there were developed through informal collaborations with corporations. So in particular, the involvement of GE in the whole evolution of the art of science learning. So we've cross-trained. So for example, our faculty have trained faculty at Crotonville, and our faculty have learned from faculty at Crotonville a great deal also about different aspects of facilitating and so forth. These workshops some were initially developed for the art of science learning and further refined at Crotonville, and others it went the other way. So that's one answer to the question, is that corporations that actually adopt this both benefit from it, but also contribute to the evolution of a dynamic field of practice. If there's one thing that is sort of bred in the bone of the use of arts-based learning, it's the idea in mind that disciplines and types of knowledge and communities and people urgently need connection and benefit enormously through those connections if they're meaningful, well-done connections, and that the arts are a unique way of doing that, representing as they do embodiments of universal expression and learning and creative thinking. So the truth is, though, that there are also all kinds of very short-term pressures on business. And it's very interesting right now. The Business Roundtable is involved in this whole conversation about the meaning of the corporation, and they have 183 CEOs of America's largest companies have just signed a statement that it's no longer all about maximizing shareholder value. We'll see, but still, they were impelled to do that. They were impelled to do that by the same forces that, talking earlier about a workshop that we do that uses suminagashi to explore leading in complex and ambiguous environments where you have to use influence, and how uncomfortable that is for business leaders who want to succeed at it by painting a dog, or whatever it is that they think that they ought to do. But that they learn these incredibly valuable things about, you can't control these forces in the world, but you can, through art, learn to influence them, and you can learn the behaviors in yourself that you can control that can help you to influence them. So that's kind of a long way of saying that the world has changed radically, and not nearly as much so as it will in the next 5 years, and that forces cause those 183 CEOs to sign that, even if they don't intend to do it. They know that they have a problem. And these are ways in which companies are now trying to explore that, as are all of us. I think there are opportunities in those explorations, and I think they go beyond both traditional models of sponsorship and also just the service provision model of going in and teaching these things. And that's what I find so interesting and potentially really powerful about impact investing. There's learning to take place across this.
Can I? First of all, the innovation and creativity of your group all along is mind-boggling. I have a couple of questions that are related. One is, how apparently you selected a group to begin with, a certain kind of arbitrariness. When you, let's say you selected 100 people, how many remained at the end? That's one.
Yep.
Okay, and the other is, do you have any insights at all, this is not what you were looking for necessarily, of different cultural groups in the first place, whether it's economic, cultural, or maybe genetically cultural?
Okay, so a couple of quick things. First, the attrition rate was considerable, as you could imagine, and it varied from incubator to incubator, actually, in response to lots of different factors that would make an interesting study in their own right. Overall, I would say that about 60% of them made it all the way through. With the short controlled study, where the whole process was entirely different and where we sampled very carefully, we had 88% sustaining it, which was good because 85% was the threshold below which it would have gotten dangerous for a study. So we were kind of walking on eggshells through that a little bit. In terms of the insights and as it relates to specific cultures, the deep insight for me is that we are far more alike than we are different. And one of the ways that we're alike is that we all think that we're different. We're much more alike than we seem, and we think we are, and that one of the ways that we're all alike is that we all think that we're different. Okay.
Harvey, your final finding on transferability of skills, I found, for me, reminded me of the work that James Catterall did, where he did an initial study of students looking for the impact of arts-based learning on performance. And what he found, and it got a lot of traction in the arts education world, because it kind of moved away from our SAT scores going up or our standardized test scores going up, and looked more at a lot of the same softer skills that you were looking at, and that the conference board looked at. Better ability to work together as part of a team, better ability to innovate, those things that might not show up initially in test scores. And then he looked at the same, and it was a very big study and longitudinal. So they went back to the same young people, I think it was 10 years later, when they were adults and out of school. And what they found was a really strong, statistically significant impact on, I guess, what we would now call almost like how we're moving towards trying to measure gross domestic happiness. So the kinds of, again, softer skills that led to better lives. They were more likely to be volunteering. They were more likely to be in a stable, healthy relationship. They were more likely to be involved in their community, to be in a stable job. And so I think that finding was also interesting, because I think we have a tendency in this work to focus on, did it result in a new scientific innovation, in those kind of short-term measures. But I think there's also this larger measure of, it makes us better people. And that ultimately affects so many other things.
There was a level beyond that actually led James towards. And he came to our San Diego conference and led a workshop there, actually. And out of that study, the book that was called Doing Well by Doing Good, by Doing Art. And so the question then is, how does it do that? And he started, I cut this slide just before because of interest of time, but he did this really fascinating meta-study of 40 neuroimaging studies done over a 20-year period that looked at both the brain experiencing art, which could, in some of those studies, it wasn't so clean, but in some of those studies they were making art, and some that were studying art, but all involved with art in one way or another. And then another 20 studies where the brain was experiencing empathy. And he compared the overlay of neural substrates between art and empathy to between either of those two things in a number of other areas, language, and so on and so forth. And there was this remarkable sort of shared neural circuitry between the empathic circuitry and art. And it was his belief that he was working towards a study on that it was actually possible that we could demonstrate that this is a powerful trigger for empathy. Certainly we see it in our lives and we experience it ourselves, and sometimes as teachers with our students, parents with our kids. We see it in lots of different ways. But we also see it in that data that I shared with you about the collaborative behaviors, because those behaviors are the behaviors of empathy. Empathic listening and trust and mutual respect and openness and tolerance, and all of these things. And we, in that particular study, it's important to keep in mind, those were effects that we saw that where a lot of other things were going on in the room. And they were doing art for 9 hours over a 5-week period. And we nevertheless saw those kinds of impacts.
Just to reiterate something, Harvey didn't talk about it here too much except the end, and it's really important to build on this, exactly what he said. If you look at studies in neuroaesthetics and brain-based learning, what makes information stick, everything he just said and described by way of process, these informal learning processes are extensively studied. If you look at, for example, Neuroscience News, 25 years of pick-hour research on learning and memory, you'll find all kinds of fascinating data and empirical studies that would support that.
Thanks, Todd. So Matt had to go to clinic, and I am